Forgotten Frontlines. The battle nobody believes happened. The Battle of Castle Itter, May 1945. Imagine the war is almost over. The end is visible, like a door at the end of a hallway. You can't see the details yet, but you can feel it. Air raids have become less frequent. Radios crackle with fragments of surrender talks, and everyone is running on the same exhausted question. How many more people have to die before this finishes? Now picture something that sounds impossible. On the last full day of the fighting in Europe, in a medieval castle perched high in the Austrian Alps, American soldiers and German soldiers fought as allies, side by side in the same battle line against other Germans. Not because they suddenly agreed on politics, not because anyone decided war was a misunderstanding. They did it to protect a group of prisoners who only days earlier had been enemies of the Nazis, enemies of the men guarding them, enemies of the war itself. It doesn't read like history, it reads like a movie plot that's too strange to be true. And yet, it's real. This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, often called the strangest battle of World War II, and it still slips through the cracks of mainstream memory. Spring 1945. The world is closing in. By spring 1945, Nazi Germany was not just losing, it was collapsing. To the east, Soviet forces were pushing in hard, shattering defenses that had once looked solid. Whole formations crumbled. Reports stopped making sense. Men surrendered because their options ran out, not because they had suddenly changed their minds. To the west, American, British, and French forces were advancing too, faster than the Nazis expected, faster than anyone had planned for in the early war years. Germany's leaders, trapped in their bunker worldview, kept imagining a miracle that never came. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was weeks away from his death. The Reich was dying in slow motion, with every day bringing clearer signs that the old system wouldn't survive the month. But while the war was clearly nearing its end, it wasn't ending gently. Not for civilians, not for prisoners, not for soldiers at the local level, who still face the immediate question. When the front moves, what happens to the people you're responsible for? A castle in the Alps, the setting you wouldn't expect. Deep in the mountains of the Austrian Tyrol, far away from the major roads, where armies moved and where artillery sounded like thunder across the valley, there stood a castle, Schloss Itter. For centuries, it had been just that, an ordinary castle in the alpine landscape. Stone walls, steep approaches, narrow roads winding around cliffs, high ground that gave you the advantage if you were trying to hold off attackers. In peacetime, it would have seemed almost timeless. In wartime, it was exactly the kind of place that people imagine when they think about hiding things. Isolated, quiet, hard to reach. And in 1943, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, made sure it wasn't just a castle anymore. He turned it into something unusual, even by Nazi standards. Not a concentration camp for mass murder in the classic sense. Not a battlefield holding area. It became a prison for high-value hostages, political insurance. The Nazi plan, cold and simple, was that these prisoners would matter to whoever came next. If Germany could not win the war, then perhaps the Nazis could still negotiate the outcome by holding prominent people alive. People whose lives could become bargaining chips. People whose survival might be tied to the fate of German prisoners later. People whose death might cause outrage, panic, or international political pressure. In other words, the regime treated human lives like leverage. Who was inside Schloss Itter? The prisoners inside Castle Itter were not ordinary prisoners of war. They weren't just captured soldiers waiting for exchange. They were prominent French figures, political leaders, military-linked administrators, resistance-connected personalities, and people who represented the kind of influence Nazi Germany feared. Among them, you'd find former French prime ministers, a former commander-in-chief of the French army, trade union leaders connected to resistance networks, a famous tennis player who had become involved in the resistance, someone whose identity alone made the captivity feel personal, not bureaucratic. Even relatives of Charles de Gaulle, whose name mattered to Nazi leadership because the Free French were among the regime's most persistent enemies. Some of these men had been in captivity for months or longer. Many had been moved around, prison to prison, location to location, always waiting for the next transfer, the next rumor, the next uncertainty. They weren't prisoners in the way soldiers often imagined, surrounded by uniforms and exchanged documents. They were trapped because the Nazis wanted them trapped, as long as the regime still had a reason to keep them. And by spring 1945, that reason was becoming a nightmare. Because as Germany's collapse accelerated, the Nazis faced the same desperate fear that haunted camps across Europe. What if the prisoners are freed before the regime can prevent it? What if the SS can't finish what it was told to finish? Orders nobody wanted to talk about. In those last chaotic weeks, it wasn't only the front line that terrified people. Inside camps and prisons, guards and administrators lived with a different kind of fear: orders. During the war, Nazi leadership had repeatedly given directions, at various times in different places, that certain high-value prisoners were not to be left alive if they were about to fall into Allied hands. So when the American advance began to close on Austria, the guards at Schloss Itter started to panic. They watched the map change. They heard rumors. They saw other units retreat or break. They realized the end might come faster than their orders could be carried out. And that panic did what panic always does. It created chaos. The camp commandant fled the castle, abandoning his post as the front collapsed around him. Guards scattered, not knowing whether to stand their ground, flee for their own lives, or carry out a last brutal task before the war truly ended. Inside the stone walls, the prisoners had to ask themselves a terrifying question. If nobody is coming to protect us, will we be executed when the SS decides it's time? They didn't know. Not really. And in the final days of April, that uncertainty hardened into dread. The man who could change everything. Joseph Gengel. He was Joseph Gengel, a German officer in the regular army, the Wehrmacht, not the SS. That detail matters, because in people's minds, a German officer at that time usually means something simple: enemy, oppressor, contributor to the machine. Gengel was not that simple. He was a career soldier who had fought on multiple fronts through a brutal war. By spring 1945, he had become disillusioned, not with the idea of serving his country in the abstract, but with the regime that had turned service into fanaticism. And rather than only thinking about it, he started acting on it. He was quietly working with local Austrian resistance fighters, men who tried to prevent unnecessary destruction when the end was unavoidable. They weren't trying to win a war they couldn't win. They were trying to save lives and stop senseless violence in the last stretch. Gengel understood something that many people learned too late. When a regime is dying, it sometimes becomes more dangerous, not less. And he knew the SS could be capable of leaving no witnesses, especially when orders said to do exactly that. When Gengel learned that SS forces intended to eliminate the prisoners at Schloss Itter before American troops could reach them, something in him snapped into action. He didn't just plan to defect quietly. He didn't just try to look away. He decided to intervene directly, even though it could get him executed immediately by his own side. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose his future. He might lose his life right there in the mountains as an alleged traitor. An impossible alliance, reaching the Americans. Gengel needed help, and the only help that could arrive in time would be from the American units moving through the region. So he did something that must have felt unreal to everyone involved. He approached American troops while presenting himself as a German officer, calm enough to be taken seriously, direct enough to be understood, but in a uniform that could have made him a threat. He contacted Captain John C. Lee, Jr., an American armored reconnaissance officer advancing through the area. And Gengel's message wasn't a surrender plea. It wasn't "I'm joining you." It wasn't even "save me." It was an offer of an alliance against a common, immediate threat. Gangel explained the situation. The prisoners inside Castle Itter, French VIPs, were at risk. SS forces might attack and execute them. American units were moving in, but time was extremely short. If help came fast enough, they could stop the SS assault. He was asking the Americans to do something they almost certainly had not planned for: fight alongside German soldiers against Germans, against the SS. In April and May 1945, most people didn't have the luxury of complicated alliances. The war had been too violent, too absolute, too deeply defined by hatred. And yet Captain Lee agreed. Because for Lee, the logic was straightforward, even if the optics were not. Protecting people in immediate danger mattered more than tidy categories. So together, Gangel, a handful of Germans loyal to him, and an American unit advancing nearby, they formed the beginnings of a relief mission. A small one, a fragile one, a one-shot kind of mission. No large reinforcements had arrived. No plan had been rehearsed in advance. No one had time for a grand strategy. They had a narrow window and a desperate need. The tank, Besatten Jenny. When the plan formed into action, it didn't look like a Hollywood rescue with helicopters and cinematic music. It looked like survival. A single Sherman tank, nicknamed Besatten Jenny by its crew, became the centerpiece of the mission. Not because tanks were magic, but because a tank gave them something crucial. It gave them firepower, mobility, and intimidation in a setting where the castle's stone walls and high ground could otherwise turn every close approach into a nightmare. Along with the tank came a small number of American soldiers. Also included were several German Wehrmacht troops loyal to Gangel, men who, in that moment, chose to side with saving lives rather than with blindly following the SS. They moved along narrow mountain roads toward Schloss Itter, knowing that somewhere in the surrounding area, SS forces might be regrouping, watching, or preparing to strike. And if the SS arrived first, then the rescue would fail, or worse, it would come too late. They had no air support. They had no huge advantage in numbers. They had no guarantee. What they had was urgency, and a belief that if they acted quickly enough, they might stop the killing. Inside the walls, a surreal moment of switching sides. When the small relief force finally reached the castle and made contact with the prisoners, the atmosphere inside must have felt unreal. Think about what these prisoners had lived through.
They had been hostages of a regime that treated them as bargaining chips. They had watched guards panic. They had listened to uncertainty creeping through every day. They had prepared, in some private way, for the possibility that they would be the last thing to die when the SS arrived.
So when armed men entered the scene, not just men, but German soldiers, the emotional impact would have been intense and confusing. The French prisoners, in particular, had to absorb a shocking reality. German soldiers who had been part of their captivity were now guarding them. Not politely, not symbolically. They were actively protecting them, placing themselves between the prisoners and the threat. But old suspicions didn't vanish instantly. The French prisoners had political rivalries that went beyond wartime propaganda. Some men had spent decades with bitter differences that didn't disappear just because the guard uniform changed. So even as they understood in their bones that survival was the priority, they were also likely to remain wary of each other as well as of the soldiers standing nearby. In chaotic moments like that, trust is something you build in real time, bullet by bullet. But for now, the guards, American, German, and those French prisoners who could defend themselves were all pointed towards the same looming danger. Something was coming, and they had to hold out. May 5th, 1945, the SS assault begins. On the morning of May 5th, 1945, the situation finally broke open. An SS battalion moved in with the intention of retaking the castle and finishing what the SS guards had failed to complete. In other words, the SS came to stop the survivors from surviving. The defenders were badly outnumbered. By most accounts, Fewer than 20 American and German soldiers were at the castle's core defense, plus a handful of French prisoners who had decided they didn't want to wait passively for execution.
The attackers were more numerous, perhaps over 100, so if you imagine this like a normal battle, the outcome seems obvious.
Small group, big group. Castle walls don't magically make physics disappear. Eventually, the bigger side should win. But real life, especially near the end of a collapsing regime, doesn't always follow clean patterns.
Because the defenders had one advantage the SS wasn't fully prepared to respect: the castle itself.
Why a medieval castle could beat a modern assault? Schloss Itter wasn't designed for World War II tactics. It was designed for older warfare, sieges, archers, slower movements, smaller-scale attacks. But in 1945, those old features became terrifyingly useful. Thick medieval stone walls absorbed bullets and shrapnel. Narrow windows gave defenders positions where they could aim and fire with limited exposure. High ground forced attackers to advance uphill into lines of sight that favored the people behind cover. Every courtyard and corridor became a choke point.
The SS assault wasn't just walking into open territory. It was trying to overpower a built environment that forced it to slow down and expose itself.
And the defenders had another advantage: a single tank. The Sherman tank's main gun repeatedly pushed SS attackers back from the castle perimeter, disrupting attempts to close in quickly.
For hours, it was a kind of anchor, a moving, firing presence that kept the assault from becoming a simple rush. But tanks can't fight forever. Even a tank with decent mobility and firepower has limits. Ammunition runs down. Parts get damaged. Bullets and shrapnel find weak spots. The battlefield is always changing.
At some point during the battle, the Sherman was struck and disabled.
Now the defenders had to rely on rifles, machine guns, grenades, whatever they had left, and on the castle's defensive geometry. A building designed for siege warfare suddenly became the main character.
The SS had to deal with rooms, corners, narrow lines of approach, and defenders willing to shoot from almost every opening.
The French prisoners who picked up rifles. One of the most remarkable details, one that makes the story even more human, is what some of the French prisoners did once the battle truly started. These men weren't soldiers in the usual sense. Many had spent years as political detainees. They weren't trained on battlefields the way frontline troops were trained. And yet, as the fighting drew closer, several of them picked up weapons and fought. Not because they wanted to become heroes, not because they wanted to join the war, because they understood the simplest truth in any siege. If you do nothing, your survival depends on other people's mercy. And mercy from a fanatical faction at the end of a war was not something you could count on. A former French prime minister, for example, is reported to have fired a rifle from a castle window while defending his own life.
That image is strange in the most powerful way, because it collapses all the distance between politics and personal danger.
A man who had been imprisoned as a political symbol was now defending himself like any human being who refused to die on command. The same battle line held. American soldiers trying to prevent atrocities. German Wehrmacht men risking everything to protect prisoners. French political prisoners defending themselves rather than waiting to be killed. History usually tries to keep these categories separate. In Castle Itter, they bled together. Joseph Gengel's final choice. Through the battle, Joseph Gengel remained central, not as a mythic figure, but as a leader doing what he had decided had to be done. He fought to protect the very prisoners he had helped bring under guard. He was German, and he was defending French civilians against SS attackers who had been part of the same broader enemy system. At some point, the situation became more desperate. SS forces pushed closer. The defenders' numbers and ammunition were finite. In those conditions, people don't always think in speeches. They think in decisions. Protect this person, move that position, hold this corridor, stop that firing line. Ganglen's final act was described by witnesses as protection in the most direct sense, positioning himself to shield civilians from incoming fire.
He wouldn't live through the day. Gangle was killed by sniper fire while attempting to protect a French prisoner from an incoming round.
In that moment, his choice, made days earlier when he decided to seek Allied help, became permanent. He died defending people his nation had held as prisoners.
A German officer, honored afterward in his local Austrian memory, not because he served the war machine bravely, but because his last act of loyalty was to human life, rather than to a regime that had already lost legitimacy.
That kind of story is hard to place into the usual good guys versus bad guys framework, because it forces you to confront the fact that not all enemies behave the same, even under the same uniform. Running low, the clock inside the castle. After hours of fighting, you can feel the pressure rising in the story, even without technical details. When ammunition runs low, everything changes. Firing becomes more careful. Decisions get harsher. The defenders start to count what's left. Every assault wave becomes more dangerous. The defenders held out longer than most people would have expected from such an uneven setup. A small group of exhausted men cannot keep up a siege forever, especially when the attackers are still coming, still determined, still committed to finishing the job. Then a different kind of hope appeared. Word of the siege reached other American units in the region. A larger relief column started moving toward Castle Itter, reinforced with more armor and infantry. This mattered because it changed the geometry of the battle. Up to that point, the SS assault had been focused like a blade: attack the castle, overwhelm the defenders, retake the hostages, end the problem. But when the relief force arrived, when it broke through the surrounding tree line, the SS attackers suddenly faced something they hadn't planned for. They were caught between the defenders still holding the castle's walls and a fresh American force closing in from outside. That's a nightmare scenario for any unit, not just under pressure, but pressured from more than one direction at once, without the ability to choose a clean retreat route. Within minutes, the battle turned. The SS assault collapsed. Surviving attackers scattered into the forest rather than risk annihilation. In other words, the rescue succeeded, not because the defenders were invincible, but because timing finally swung their way. The castle held long enough for help to arrive. The aftermath. Freedom on the last days of the war. After nearly a full day of desperate fighting, Castle Itter became a rare kind of battlefield ending. The French prisoners who had been held for years as hostages were finally free in a real, immediate sense. Not promised freedom, not maybe later, but freedom that arrived because bullets stopped flying against them. No more execution orders, no more sealed doors, no more waiting for the next guard to decide your future. And then, just a few days later, the war would officially end. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. So Castle Itter happened in the strange space between collapse and final announcement, when people still carried out violence because they believed they still had time to make their own version of history. But the castle's defenders forced that version to fail.
What happened to the survivors?
For many survivors, life didn't reset like a button being pushed. They had been held as symbols and then rescued as people. That transition alone would have been psychologically jarring.
In the years that followed, many of the French prisoners resumed their political careers and public lives. Some returned to positions of influence. Not all, not easily, and not without lingering trauma, but the key point is that they lived long enough to continue.
In the official memory of their countries, the battle remained a strange footnote, often overshadowed by the broader narratives of liberation and the vast scale of World War II.
But local memory did something different for one person, Josef Gangle. In the Austrian town near the castle, he was later remembered as a genuine local hero. A street was named after him.
It wasn't a celebration of war. It was an acknowledgement of a choice made in a moment when the normal rules of loyalty were breaking down, and when someone chose conscience over orders.
Why this battle was so forgotten? You might wonder, If this happened, why doesn't everyone know about it? There are a few reasons, and none of them are entirely comfortable. First, the battle is too hard to categorize.
Most World War II stories are built to fit into understandable structures: Allies versus Axis, Liberators versus Occupiers, Frontlines versus Rear Areas, Heroes versus Villains. Castle Itter doesn't fit neatly into those templates.
At the same time, it did not allow heroes to stay pure. It involved prisoners picking up rifles. It involved a German officer who turned against his own side. It involved American troops cooperating with Germans against the SS.
It's a story with moral complexity. That complexity makes it harder for people to repeat casually and easier for it to get pushed aside.
Second, the war's ending created a flood of other memories. Liberation marches, city battles, mass surrenders, trials that would come later. In the larger historical record, Castle Itter was small in scale.
A castle in the Alps doesn't compete with major capitals falling or entire divisions surrendering. And yet, for the people inside it, the scale didn't matter. For them, it was everything.
Third, the shadow of stigma and ideology followed everyone involved. In the decades after the war, communities often preferred stories that didn't require uncomfortable rethinking.
A battle where American and German troops fought as allies, especially in direct open combat, creates awkward questions. How do you talk about the enemy when the enemy also contains conscience? How do you explain a rescue that required cooperation where hatred had previously been absolute?
Some stories survive by being simple. This one survives because it's true. But being true doesn't always guarantee being remembered.
The only confirmed case of Americans and Germans fighting as allies versus the SS.
Even today, historians struggle with how to place Castle Itter inside World War II's usual categories. It remains, as far as confirmed documentation goes, one of the only battles where American and German troops fought as direct allies in the same conflict against the SS.
That fact isn't trivia. It's the heart of why the battle still shocks people. Because enemy didn't just mean politics or geography here.
It meant a lived relationship of years, occupation and resistance, imprisonment and propaganda, brutality and punishment. And still, in a very specific moment, the enemy line shifted.
Not because the past was erased, not because they forgot the war, but because a different value became urgent: keep people alive.
What makes Castle Itter feel so human?
If you strip away the battle description and the historical framing, what you're left with is deeply human. It's a story about people doing what they can when the world is breaking apart. A Wehrmacht officer decides that following orders might kill innocents. An American captain listens to a desperate request and chooses protection over neat assumptions.
Prisoners who have been treated like pawns refuse to remain pawns. And a medieval castle, built long before tanks and machine guns, becomes a shelter because stone and geometry can sometimes matter more than ideology. And in the center of it, there's a single tragic image: Joseph Gangle dying while trying to shield a French prisoner from a sniper's bullet.